Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today on pre-teaching strategies, how you can help English language learners. We are glad to have you all here with us this afternoon. Our presenter is Susan McDonald. She is a speech language pathologist and an English language instructor. She earned her K-12 ESL endorsement in 2006 and has presented on best practices for assessment of English language learners in special education at regional TESOL conferences, contributed to the development of an assessment guide for ELLs for Vermont's Department of Education, and has completed sheltered instruction observation protocol training for ELLs in the classroom. She is a coordinator and faculty member for a speech language pathology assistant training program at Cerritos College in Norwalk, California, and private educational consultant and an English language teacher. So I am now going to turn it over to Susan.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. Thank you so much for joining us and taking the time out of, I'm sure what's been a very interesting week for everyone. As Jessica mentioned, my name is Susan McDonald, and I'm here to share some strategies with you around pre-teaching. And this is really designed to help English language learners in your classroom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just tell you a little bit about what our goals are for today, and I'll have a quick question to kind of open up some discussion in the chat room. You should be able to see a chat option for yourselves to type in, and if you haven't already, go ahead and just type in who you are, where you're signing in from, what state. As I mentioned, I'm in California, and I think we have people from all over the states, which is wonderful. Let's make sure I've got my buttons here. There we go. Okay, so in this webinar, we're going to talk about what pre-teaching is and some common strategies to help English language learners become familiar with content and concepts before beginning a unit or a lesson. We're going to talk about why these strategies can be useful and how you can begin to implement these in your classroom. My goal for you today is to be able to describe pre-teaching strategies and have a sense of how this could fit into your classroom in one way, shape, or other, by the end of this webinar. I don't want you to think I'm asking you to implement all of these things at once, but if you can take one thing away from that you can apply in one of your next lessons or units, that would be amazing. If you are participating in the live version of this webinar, like I said, you can pop in to the chat room and let us know where you're coming in from. And so I want to ask you all, for those of you who are live participants, if you could share a little bit about what do you think pre-teaching is, and any strategies that you use for pre-teaching if you're already using those. So I would just love to know what's your understanding of pre-teaching, and if you have used pre-teaching strategies, if you could share a little bit about what that looks like to you in your classroom in the chat box. And while we're waiting for people to kind of enter that, I'm just going to start talking and I'm going to explain why I really believe in pre-teaching. And one of the reasons why I think pre-teaching strategies are really powerful is that, after working with so many students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds in the public schools, I've never seen a one-size-fits-all English language learner. They all have different profiles and skill bases. They come to the classroom with different skills in literacy, in grammar, in vocabulary, and in their knowledge of cultural norms for the American classroom. So just like the puzzle here in the slide, each student has a different configuration of vocabulary skills, background knowledge, and grammar that will help them put the pieces together to understand the whole picture of what you're teaching them. So social studies in particular has a lot of vocabulary specific to this content area and requires students to use these terms in more advanced grammar structures and sentence types that are not typically used in social conversation. Okay, so a lot of times in the English language teaching world, we talk about conversational language versus academic language. And we're really asking students to use language at a different level in the academic situation and setting. because these students need to use academic language for, doing Bloom's taxonomy types of tasks, like comparing and contrasting, summarizing and synthesizing, and analyzing. So establishing that foundation in the key vocabulary, the grammar, and the topics that can help students access the curriculum more effectively. Okay, yeah, so I'm looking at people's responses in the chat box. Yeah, Monica says allowing students to become familiar with vocabulary words prior to lessons, and that's definitely something we're going to talk about more. That's for sure a pre-teaching strategy. Mary says that working on trying to build a bit of prior knowledge and vocabulary to level the playing field a bit more. And I love how you phrase that, Mary. I think that's perfectly explained right there. We want to level the playing field so that students aren't overwhelmed by not just the cognitive demands of the classroom, but also the language demands can be challenging too. So we want to make sure that we're really looking at making that a more a fair place for everyone to start. Okay, so we're going to talk about what pre-teaching is, and I'm going to focus on a few different aspects of it today. It's not a comprehensive list of different types of pre-teaching strategies, but 3 main principles that will help you kind of get started with this concept. So pre-teaching, as our participants said, it's really helping to prepare the student for the language, the concepts, and the skills that are going to be addressed in a lesson or unit. And I'm going to just move my screen a little bit here. There we go. So one of the things that we're going to talk about is, with pre-teaching, the reasons why it's important is because students need to understand at least 90% of the words in a passage to comprehend things independently. So if students need to understand 90% of the words in their textbook, they need, even before they get to the reading of that, think about the auditory skills that they also need to have. Okay, so when we think about English language skills, we also look at the domains of language. We talk about how this child or the student needs to have certain listening skills. They need to have spoken language skills. They need to have reading skills and writing skills. And so if we take this fact, that students need to understand at least 90% of the words in a reading passage to understand this, that text independently by themselves, we have to think about, okay, so if we're talking about this and using the same language in the classroom setting, what do they need to be able to understand? And so we can, we need to look at how we're, the language that we're requiring the child to understand already before they've even started the unit. And so if you're taking this webinar, participating in it, you must have at least one English language learner in your classroom, or it's very likely that you will have one in the future. And these students are really relying on you to teach them not just the content of social studies, but to help them mediate the language skills, to help them access the curriculum. And I think a lot of teachers say, well, I'm not an English language teacher and all that, and I completely understand, but you do have the tools to help those students understand and break down the language of the text a little bit more, and it is our responsibility to do that so that they can be successful in our classrooms. So pre-teaching strategies, if they're built into your lesson routines, can be a really effective way to help English language learners access the curriculum. And we're going to focus on a few main goals of pre-teaching for the purposes of this webinar. Okay, so as we discussed with pre-teaching, this is a method to prepare students for the language and concepts and skills that are going to be used in a given lesson or unit. And it's designed to help them activate or build background knowledge of a topic or subject so they can connect it with other existing vocabulary and knowledge. Pre-teaching strategies can also provide organization for what students are going to be learning using a variety of visual tools. Okay, so not just getting a background schema for things, but also helping them prepare their brains for organizing this information. And then we're also going to talk about previewing key vocabulary so they're familiar with new words and concepts. Let's see here. Let me move my, trying to make sure I can see everything on my screen here. All right. One of the things I wanted to discuss was that what pre-teaching isn't. And that really is, we want to make sure that we're not, you're not thinking in your minds that, okay, pre-teaching means I have to teach the lesson ahead of time. And that's not what pre-teaching isn't. Pre-teaching is not a way to reduce the complexity of the curriculum either. It's not a way to simplify concepts. And it's not designed to teach the student the lesson before the actual lesson. Pre-teaching is more of a selective preparation of key concepts in language so that the student will be that the student's going to be using in the actual lesson or upcoming unit. Pre-teaching strategies are also not just for the English language learner, but it can also benefit students who come from impoverished backgrounds, students with mild to moderate learning disabilities, and at-risk learners. So pre-teaching really helps the student be more mentally prepared for the new unit, and it can help the teacher get a sense of what they're going to need to help that English language learner with once a new unit has begun. So where do we begin? What do I pre-teach? Okay, one of the things that I recommend before you even get to the pre-teaching strategies is identifying and selecting important vocabulary or terms that are homophones. And homophones are words that are spelled the same and sound the same, but they have different meanings. Okay, and I have some examples that we're going to talk about in just a minute. But if you have questions about your curriculum and vocabulary that could be challenging for individual students, I do highly recommend that you connect with your school's ESL teacher and have them look over some of your curriculum, and they can probably really quickly identify some vocabulary words that would be challenging for your students. I want you to review the materials that the students are exposed to and interacting with in the upcoming unit, and try to examine some things that could be challenging for maybe how they're phrased. So here's some examples that you can look at in terms of, oh, I think I might have skipped one thing here. But one of the things that you can look at is what are the topics and the words that you need to address. And I think, yeah, I jumped ahead. There we go. Sorry about that. So the vocabulary that you would address in your lesson that has multiple meanings, it could be confusing, might be something like the word held, right? We have two different meanings of held. The elections were held in each district, means they took place, or the other meaning of held, the athlete held the trophy up. So for an English language learner, that could be kind of confusing. And so going through the text, going through any kind of curriculum materials that the child's or student's going to be exposed to and need to use and understand, that's going to be helpful to identify ahead of time. Another example of that would be the word revolution. The sun makes one revolution around the earth in a day. The rebels started the revolution in 1898. Okay, so the difference is clear to us, but to a student who has just learned revolution regarding the science meaning, they're going to be really confused about revolution as it relates to a social studies context. Okay, so we want to make sure that we're identifying words that have more than one meaning. The other thing that you need to do is look for sentences that embed a lot into the sentence in terms of meaning, and those sentences that use conjunctions that express a relationship between two or more ideas. And these are things that you'll see more in high school level texts, of course. So for example, colonists in favor of independence begin using propaganda to gather support for their cause. So the subject in this is very long, colonists in favor of independence. So things like that could be a little challenging for beginner to intermediate level English language learners. Another example, the two-chamber design of Congress is based on the central principle of American government. That government must be divided into units that share power to provide a system of checks and balances. So these long sentences are things to bring to their attention and give them a little bit of understanding ahead of time, so that when they run into these grammatical structures, they're not going to be thrown off and potentially shut down or ignore, but they're going to be empowered to figure out what that means, okay? And so that's the thing, is we don't want to overwhelm them, and so giving them information and language ahead of time and key phrasing that they're going to see in the text will be really helpful in reducing anxiety about the learning process. So another way that we can also look at this too is not just with vocabulary, but with concepts that are going to be covered by a particular unit, okay? And so one of the things that you all are held to is social studies standards. And so if we look at the state standard here, which would be a 10th grade standard, it says students will analyze the political and economic changes in the 16th century, know the great voyages of discovery, the locations of the routes, and the influence of cartography in the development of a new European worldview. So if we want to think about what concepts the students are going to be learning, and also, you know, the terminology associated with those concepts, we've got voyage and exploration, we have economy and markets, we have cultural influences, and we have cause-effect concepts, okay? So those are things that the student, it's not that they don't understand it, that they don't have the cognitive ability to understand, but they'll need the language attached to those concepts so they can articulate it for different assignments and participate and understand what they're reading. So let's talk about some things that we can do to figure out what words students do know. And one of the things I've come across in my work on this is a quick comprehension check using like a quick little checklist students can you know, give you, so that you can quickly identify, okay, do they know this word? You know, how familiar are they with it? And so as the instructor, you would come up with a list of words, okay? And then the student would have to check, I've never heard of the word, or I think the word means or is related to, and then they would fill in another word that's similar to that. I've heard the word, but don't know what it means. And then I know the word, okay? So that way you kind of get a sense from all of your students, where are they at with understanding these key concepts and terms that they're going to be using in the next unit. Another way to do this is, you know, really quick, get a passage from a text or other unit materials, and have the students highlight with a highlighter any words that they don't understand, so that you know what to pre-teach. So that can take I think that really reduces the amount of, you know, analysis time. But the challenge with that is, you know, you'd have to go over, so if you have 30 students in your class, you have to go over 30 passages. The first activity that I gave you that lists the words, that just will give you a much quicker kind of way to assess that. But I think the value of having the student look at a word in a passage is that they can see it with the context of other words that might help them make sense of it. So we have to think about, are we assessing their understanding of the words in a decontextualized environment like that word list, or are we giving them context for it with the sentence paragraph? But either way, just coming up with some kind of quick check-in so that you are familiar, like you know what the words are that you're going to be teaching for that unit, and you're checking to see that the students are familiar with them, and or which ones they're really not familiar with, okay? So here's a quick chart that you can use to kind of keep track of all of that. And then you can put up homophones in one particular section so that you're aware of which terms might be misleading for the students. And then we have key grammar structures. So we have the concept of before. An example is, before Columbus voyaged to the Caribbean, the Spanish had already established a presence in Mexico. So that even if the student understands the word before, seeing it in a more academic sentence can be a little confusing with all of the words around it. And so one of those things might be something that you need to practice, thinking about before in a more abstract way. And then we have passive sentences. The 16th century European economy was heavily influenced by the spice trade with Asian countries. So when we have a passive sentence, we have usually the word by as an indicator in there, and something happened to something else by another agent. And so here, just identifying those more confusing or higher level grammar structures, again, is going to be something to kind of bring awareness to the students. And, you know, as you're becoming familiar with your materials, some of you are going to know your curriculum and your materials really well, but it's always, you know, if you're new to your, you know, whatever the curriculum is that you're using, if you're using a new book, things like that, it really does pay to kind of go through everything and look at this and see what could be challenging for the student. And you're only going to have to do it once, right? So taking that time to kind of look through everything and identifying key grammar structures and keywords, that's something that you can always check with whatever group you're working with for the years to come as well, until they change the curriculum again on you. So then there's, in the other column here in this chart, you can write down key vocabulary and concepts that you really want the student to be able to understand prior to the unit. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how you can work on training them or teaching them these vocabulary and concepts in a way that's not teaching them the lesson before the lesson, but really giving them a foundation. So one of the strategies we're going to talk about is activating and building background knowledge. And so we have an idea of what vocabulary words we're looking at, what concepts we want them to be familiar with, and the grammar structures, okay? So the first strategy that we're going to talk about is getting that background knowledge established. And one of the things that's a really easy, fun thing to do is brainstorming their understanding of a topic. Okay, so we want to see how is the student connecting to this idea. And so for pre-teaching about voyage and exploration, then just, you know, think about it in terms that kids can relate to in that particular, in that community that you work in. You know, the idea of a voyage, exploration may seem very abstract, and they may only think about it or, you know, see pictures of, you know, like Neil Armstrong exploring space, you know, voyages, thinking about Christopher Columbus, or maybe they've seen, you know, videos, but we can make it a lot more accessible by, you know, breaking that down to something that they've done in their life. So, you know, ask the students a question, you know, have you ever been on a trip that's been to a new place? And, you know, connecting that to the idea of you went on a voyage somewhere, you know, and it's not as grand as maybe Christopher Columbus's voyage, but it was a trip. It was going from place to place. And so connecting that with something that's real for them is a good starting point. And so you want to, with that, not just identifying, have you been on a voyage, but what were some things that you experienced when you went to that new place, you know? And even if it wasn't, maybe they haven't traveled very far, but maybe they've gone to some place new, like Disney World, or, you know, maybe there's a farmer's market, or there's some other kind of fair. What did they feel? What were the senses? What were the kinds of things they experienced when they went somewhere new? And so you can make, you know, use a little graphic organizer to kind of frame that and identify keywords and pick up things that you can connect then to your social studies unit about voyaging and voyagers. And another thing that you could do is to simulate the experience. So for example, if you want to teach that concept of cause effect and then market concepts, come up with a scenario where students have roles as merchants and traders, and then give them little scenarios where they are going to get a profit, or they have to collaborate with another merchant to problem solve a situation. You know, create different problems for them so that they have to see what is the role of, you know, what's the effect of, you know, if the cost of this product goes up in another country, how is it going to affect, you know, something that I'm selling as the merchant? So trying to get them to experience it will be a lot more powerful, and they are definitely going to remember that when you connect this experience to what they learn in the unit to come. So that's definitely going to be a lot more powerful. And we know that research is showing experiential learning, social emotional impact really connects vocabulary in kids' brains. And so we want to try to implement that as much as possible. So we have some other strategies for pre-teaching, and one is to help organize the learning. And what I really think is helpful for a lot of kids, definitely not English language learners, because I see a lot of this in the college where I work, is that a lot of students really don't know how to take notes. And depending on whether students have access to computers, where they can take notes on the computer, with English language learners, their skills may not be able to type fast enough to take notes on a computer, even if they could. Especially if they're listening in English. So, teaching them note-taking skills can be really helpful so that they're already prepared on how to make sense of the information they're going to be hearing. And so a simple T-chart like this, where you have the main idea on one side and then details and examples of that concept on the other, could be something that they could get practice with ahead of time, so that when it comes to making sense of what they're reading in the text or during a lecture in class, they have a way to break down that information a little bit. And for your English language learners, you can fill in some of this for them and then have them fill in the blank a little bit. You can level this so that it's going to be adjusted for whatever language level they're working at. Okay, so I definitely recommend for the ones that are, just 1 to 2 years into learning English, give them the main ideas already, give them an example, and maybe have them fill in the blank a little bit, whereas more intermediate to advanced students should be able to provide some rudimentary sentences. And, even if you give them one example, maybe they can come up with another example. So it's going to depend on the language level of the student, and just know that, coming up with different templates for different language levels will be really appreciated and really helpful for the student. And again, you can also, like I said, use those ESL teachers to help you if you're not sure what vocabulary or concepts would be new or challenging. Then I definitely recommend, collaborating with them. Another way that you can do this is through, like if we're going back to that cause-effect type of concept, giving them practical scenarios where they can see cause-effect, and then connecting that to something more abstract that they're going to be learning in your unit. So, looking at the cause, okay, I go to work and the effect is I receive a paycheck. Another cause or problem or event is I'm going to buy new sneakers, and the effect is that store gets my money. Okay, so there's lots of different ways to frame things to help organize their brains so that they're thinking about, how is this going to be working with more abstract concepts once you get into the more, historical types of events, things like that. Lastly, we want to talk about previewing vocabulary, okay? And so based on those pre-check tools that you've already learned in terms of, identifying which vocabulary words the student knows or doesn't know or needs more familiarity with it, you can establish a vocabulary journal. You can also put a word list on a board. I know a lot of we talk a lot about vocabulary boards and things like that. And the key with those is just to make sure that you're revisiting them. Don't just put the vocabulary up on the wall and leave it there and not add to it or not revisit those concepts, when you're teaching the actual unit. So you want to revisit it. You want to refresh and make sure that they understand the vocabulary words. And I'll have an example of a vocabulary journal you can use that they're adding to. I'm going to just jump to that slide so I can show you, then I'll come back to this one. So, if you want the students to create their own vocabulary journals, they can do this digitally. They can do this in just a, pen and paper notebook kind of thing. And here you have, the word that they're going to be defining. You have the space for a definition. So voyage is a long journey by ship, air, or land. And then sentence, you have a sample sentence. The Portuguese explorers voyaged to the Americas. You have a picture of what that might look like. and then a way for them to connect with this, how I can remember it. And maybe going back to that brainstorming session, maybe you had a student who voyaged from Mexico to the United States, and that definitely was, you know, something that's, you know, they're never going to forget. Is a very unique type of trip. It is truly is a voyage. So, you know, they can connect that type of experience with that concept. And so they're not going to forget that word when they have something socially or emotionally that they can connect to that term. So that's an example of a vocabulary journal that you can set up ahead of time in that pre-teaching time, and then go back and have them kind of fill in the blanks as you go through the different units or, you know, particular chapters in the text. Other things that can help with previewing vocabulary is finding videos that relate to the concepts and vocab that you're pre-teaching. You can create a quick paragraph in which they would need to fill in blanks with words from a word bank, and then they can review that as a group. So when you're you know, looking at some concepts and vocab, you can get a sense of, okay, can they get this in context? Will they be able to use the words I'm giving them and make sense of that and put it into the right sentences? So that's something that you can also try. And I recommend just as many visuals as possible. So photos, you know, news, magazine articles, and visuals to kind of connect those vocabulary words to more abstract concepts. And so really just working on connecting vocabulary to the functional daily life and current events as much as possible and as appropriate, because not everything's going to connect to something, but you have to just start somewhere. And so just keeping in mind, you know, the most essential items that you need is really, okay, what are the language concepts? What are the cognitive concepts that they're going to be learning in this unit? How do I pre-assess their knowledge of these already? And then how can I help prepare them for this in the unit to come? Okay, so there's lots of different things. Definitely vocabulary is a key aspect of this, because vocabulary is attached to anything that they're going to do in that unit. And so it's really important for them to be able to understand it auditorily, to be able to write the word, and to really be able to show that they have a sense of what that word means. And to be able to prepare them for organizing their language as well, as we talked about with graphic organizers. Those are really important as well to help support the framework for how they're going to be learning. So using note-taking skills, giving them a graphic organizer that maybe is partially filled out can also be really useful. Okay, and really connecting with that background knowledge is very important to make sure that they have a sense of where we're going with this concept. It's really, when you're teaching a lot of vocabulary, there's a lot of abstract concepts in social studies, or words that are used in different ways. We want to make sure that we're giving them a chance to identify those before they're going to be mixed in with lots of text and lots of lecture content, things like that. So I want to just ask you all, what are some strategies that you think you have used? Maybe you've already done pre-teaching, and I'm wondering if there's anything in here that you think you might be able to use in your classrooms. So I'm going to give you a minute to kind of think about that and add to the chat room here. And I'm just going to finish up with just showing you, if you need any more information on this topic, here are the resources that I've used for the presentation. Definitely one of the programs that supports the use of pre-teaching strategies is something called the SIOP model, and that's short for Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol. And Pearson Publishing does full trainings on this for different schools, but you can do lots of reading on it ahead of time to get familiar with it. And the Center for Applied Linguistics is also a wonderful resource that does some trainings on that also, and they do that virtually, which I really highly recommend. So the Center for Applied Linguistics is a wonderful resource in addition to looking up, you know, the books on SIOP. and really figuring out how you can use that in your classrooms. Okay, let's see here. So Brandy says using pictures and relating to experiences, Freyr's model for words. And Brandy, I'm not familiar with Freyr's models for words. If you could explain what that is, that'd be great for me. Is there anybody else that has maybe used pre-teaching strategies in their classroom that would like to let us know what's worked, what's been challenging? Okay. Antoinette says she's used vocabulary journal items as a game, breaking those parts up and having students find each other. Oh, I love that. Yeah, anytime you can get interactive activity, getting them talking about these things is fantastic. And we only had a half an hour really to talk about this. There's each of these little sections could be broken down into its own unique, class. So thanks for taking in all this information, and I hope that it's been helpful for you, and you can kind of take, and it's maybe validated what you've already been doing, like Antoinette, and you can apply this to your classrooms. And if you have any other questions, maybe Jessica, do we have time for a few more questions?